Hello and welcome to this edition of the International Macro History online seminar series. Very pleased today to have Gertjan Verdickt from Katholieke Universiteit Leuven presenting a co-authored paper he's written with Lyndon, who is in bed right now because he's a resident of Melbourne. It's a different time zone. So on behalf of both of them, Gertjan is here to present their research. As usual, about 40 minutes presentation with substantive questions in the last 20 minutes, and then we'll have an additional 15 minutes at the end for more informal chat. Without further ado, my name's Chris Colvin, by the way. If you want to ask questions, please put them into the Q&A box, and you can add things to the Q&A box as we go along. And over to you, Gertjan.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the introduction, Chris. I'm going to share my screen right now, which I believe you can see as of this moment. So thank you all for having me. Indeed, this is a co-authored paper with Lyndon, and this is still work in progress. So if you have any comments or feedback, it's more than welcome. So the key idea of our paper is actually to look at bailouts, but bailouts towards the real economy. And we go to the Great Depression to actually study one of the most important sectors at that time, which were railroads. Because our paper finds itself in the sphere of financial crises. Because most often in a crisis, a government is going to bail out specific parts of the economy. And if we think back about one of the most important financial crises in the last few decades, 2008, then the financial sector was most often bailed out. I think back, obviously, about what Lehman Brothers went through and all other financial institutions that followed. So there, the literature has focused a lot on bailouts toward financials that could be a potential transition mechanism towards the real economy. Now, in 2008, there were also other sectors that received some assistance, like the US automakers, which received a quarter of all the troubled asset relief program loans. Now, the issue, to do some statistical analysis on this, is that there were only two major US automakers that received all of those loans. So if we want to do more of a comprehensive statistical analysis and to really understand how bailouts towards the real economy could work in a crisis, we actually turn to the Great Depression. And in this sense, we're going to focus on the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC, and the Public Works Administration, PWA, that actually gave substantial money towards non-financial sectors during the Great Depression. So more than 10% of all of these loans actually went to that specific sector. So our paper finds itself on the balance of, on the one hand, financial and banking sector bailouts. So there's a huge literature. For instance, Diamond, who just won the Nobel Prize, actually contributed a lot on this very thing. There's also a very small but growing literature on real sector bailouts. So as I was saying, General Motors and Chrysler were the two major automakers that actually got a bailout. And there's some literature, the Journal of Economic Literature, that points towards this direction. There's a larger literature that focuses on the Asian crisis in the 90s, government bailouts. And very recently, you have Stan van Nieuwerburgh and his co-authors who focused also on the COVID-19 pandemic aid in the US. But this is more on a theoretical framework. So what we try to do within this paper is actually borrow their ideas, but apply it to one of the most important financial shocks in the world. And why do we believe this is interesting? Because by design, banks are a bit different than the real economy. Because banks can suffer runs. Think about FTX nowadays, the cryptocurrency exchange, who also suffered a run. Well, this is slightly different than a manufacturing firm. Also, banks can really shift their risk on their balance sheet. Their assets are a bit opaque, so you don't really know what is going on, and they also have various links towards the real economy. Because that is indeed something we've seen in 2008, that if you bail out a bank, there can be a transition mechanism through lending either to households or to other businesses. Now, we don't want to focus on this specific sector. In contrary, we want to focus on the real economy. So therefore, we turn to the US and we turn to railroads. And why do we focus on railroads? Because on the one hand, they're very large. So they're seen as really the blue chip stocks, the blue chip investments of that time. Also, they were one of the most important employers in the US at that time. Also, they're very interconnected, either at the end of the 19th century or in the early 20th century. So they were a very mature industry. This is, for instance, seen the fact that the railroad track mileage didn't really increase in the 1930s or even in the 1920s, for that matter. So it was already quite established and one of the most important vehicles to transport specific things. So therefore, we focus specifically on US railroads. And what are we going to do? Well, we're going to use this entire structure as it's seen right now. So this is a picture of the Santa Fe system that actually shows how interconnected these railroads really were. And this is actually something we will use. We will try to see where these railroads actually go to, which cities they link to, in which states they are, to get a better identification what the both micro implications are of those bailouts, but also more on a macro scale, what a bailout could do in terms of economic spillovers. So this is what we're going to use within our paper. We're going to try to see what the impact of such bailouts are for both firm and wider economy. So as I was saying, by the 1930s, it was already a quite mature industry. So indeed, as is put on the slide, the track length only increased marginally from the 1920s onwards. What is also very interesting and why railroads are very appealing is because they were highly regulated. They were regulated by the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission. So this helps us both from the fact that it's not just the Wild West what is going on, but on the other end, there was a lot of data available. Data availability, think about maximum freight rates, think about just any balance sheet information, also loans, cuts of service, bankruptcy, all these types of things, ratings as well. A lot of information was available at the time. What is also interesting is the bailout from the government always had to be approved by the ICC. So you had this dual mechanism from both government and regulator that actually helped to preserve the workings of the economy. So then a few words about the RFC. So for those of you who do not really know, the RFC was created at the end of 1931, the beginning of 1932, and they distributed around 20% of what's called the New Deal money. And all of that money, 11% of those loans went to railroads. For the time we are interested in, is 1932 until the end of 1931. It's about $102 million, so which is a lot of money. Now, that money was actually used as a loan for 3 years for principal repayment and interest repayment, just to make sure that the railroads didn't default on their debt. Secondly, I already highlighted this. You also have the Public Works Administration. That is a bit similar to what Biden's infrastructure deal right now in the US is. So it's money that actually goes to real infrastructure. Think about dams, bridges, schools, but also a very limited amount went to railroads as well, to really stimulate the economy to a very large extent. So where did this RFC actually come from? Well, it came from Herbert Hoover, who made a very important announcement December 8th, 1931. Because the key idea was he wants to establish all industries, both railways, financials, that could not otherwise secure credit, that they could use that additional money, that bailout money, to protect their credit structure and to stimulate employment. The reason why this is so important, the otherwise obtaining credit, is because at that time the bond market completely froze. So if a specific firm, if a specific sector was in need of money, you really had to turn elsewhere because the bondholders were not very interested in giving additional credit. And this money was eventually used to indeed support the credit structure and stimulate employment. Why is this interesting? Because those are things you can easily test with balance sheet information. So that is actually what we're going to do in our paper. We're going to see, did the RFC actually succeed in their promises of securing the credit structure of those railroads, but also stimulate employment on the other hand. Now, to really show you how important that announcement was, these are very crude, the bond yields of both railways and industries. So you see right in the beginning, there's a huge spread between the yields of those two sectors. Then the RFC gets proposed by Herbert Hoover. Afterwards, it gets published in the New York Times, and you see those spreads between those yields decrease significantly over the next few weeks/days. So this is just to highlight that this is something which is considered to be important by market participants. So this is at the height and the start of the Great Depression, which is seen as very good news. A few words about this Great Depression. I'm not going to go into depth because we're all historians here. Most of you know what the Great Depression was, but the Great Depression really started, or is alleged to be started, with a stock market crash in 1929, eventually spilled over to the banking sector. As I was saying, bond markets completely froze in 1932, 1933, and this is something we also see when we look at the bonds of those railways. That eventually led to a huge decrease in industrial output, also in GDP, led to a huge increase in unemployment, small recovery between 1933 and 36, but then again, a very severe recession at the end of that specific decade. So a lot of things are going on around that time, and this also had a huge impact on railways. Just to show you what that impact actually looks like, these are business failures in the blue line. In orange line, you have railroad income, and you have factory employment. So you see at the start of the Great Depression, those business failures increased significantly, railroad income decreased significantly. And that actually remained relatively flat. Maybe it increased a little bit in that economic recovery, but then afterwards, during the second recession, it decreases again. So you see that even though railroads were very important at that time, they're also very susceptible to these financial shocks. And also, if you look at factory employment, that also took a huge dive downwards. Maybe that is obviously that is one of the reasons why Herbert Hoover mentioned that he wants to stimulate employment. Now, as I already mentioned, our aim of this paper is relatively straightforward. The RFC mentioned two specific criteria. They wanted to restore the credit structure of firms, and they want to stimulate employment. And that is what we're going to test. We're going to see whether railroads that received specific bailout from either RFC or PWA were first less likely to default on their debt. Secondly, we're able to increase or at least maintain employment relative to non-bailed out railroads. Okay, where does our data come from? So first, as already mentioned, the ICC has a ton of data, which is amazing for financial information, which we actually digitized. Secondly, we also focused on Moody's Manual of Investment to get more comprehensive information with regards to those railroads. Think about those ratings, think about other specific things, but also to match with the ICC if there were some mistakes, if there were some things that were not very clear. Thirdly, we also use CRISP, because at the time CRISP was already around. This includes all information with regards to railroad stock prices. Now, the majority of railroads were not listed, but had bonds outstanding. So that is the fourth thing we actually do. We go to the New York Times and go to the section bond sales on the New York Stock Exchange to actually digitize all of those railroad bonds. Since there are a lot of them, we're going to focus on the two most liquid ones to actually get a sense of what did this information do to bond prices on the one hand and CRISP returns on the other. And then lastly, to get the bond market index to really see whether or not this is movement common to the entire market or whether this is very specific to railroads, we go to the Commercial and Financial Chronicle to get these bond indices. To really show you what this looks like, this is a page from the New York Times from the bond sales on the New York Stock Exchange, which we eventually digitized and we use for our event studies later on. So that's on the one hand. That's the first thing we actually do. The first thing we do, we get all of the data. The second thing we were going to do is get information with regards to those railroad loans. What we do is we go to the New York Times and we search for Reconstruction Finance Corporation or Public Works Administration from 32 up to 39 onwards. The reason why this is very interesting is because the ICC was a very active regulator and had to approve all of these loans. So therefore, we're very confident that we're actually going to find all of those loans. And actually, what we actually look for is the New York Times. We get the date of loan application and approval or rejection, because there are a few rejection as well, the amount of the loan and the name of the railroad. We digitize all of these data and then we match that eventually with the final report of the RFC, which was published, if I recall correctly, in the 1950s, to actually see whether or not we didn't miss any loans at all. But why do we go to the New York Times? Because we want to have the specific date of the application, which we can use then for event study purposes, but also to match in other econometric exercises. Now, we're currently also matching this information with the National Archives to really ensure that we didn't miss any specific details. And so far, most of the information we actually have matches that from the New York Times, which is very good in our case. To really show you what this looks like, this is an excerpt of the Interstate Commerce Commission and the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul Pacific Railroad. So this really shows you that there was a 3-year loan, as I mentioned, 3-year loans for $9 million from the RFC through the ICC that were eventually approved on May 2nd. So this is the information we're actually going to use to actually see when and for how much railroads applied and eventually got approved those specific bailouts. To show you what the time series of those railroad loans looks like, well, this is a very nice example. In each quarter from 32 to 1939 onwards, you see a huge spike in the beginning, then a smaller decrease. But as I was saying, bond markets really froze 1932, 1933. So you see also an increase at the end of 1933 in terms of RFC money that went to railroads. So what you also see is that there's a lot of variation in the timing of those bailouts, which we eventually are going to use in our econometric specification. Now, what is also important to us is who is actually sitting on the board of the RFC. So a few words on that. So in the RFC board, those were either politicians or businessmen. They were appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. Importantly, they had to be balanced by both political affiliation and by region. So either they had, they were previous lawyers, they were a Treasury Secretary, a chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, businessmen, finance, industrial, regular directors, or you had people that actually came from a more political background. So you see that there's a lot of people on this specific board, and we try to match those people either by their political affiliation, which we have a lot of information on, but also there's the state they're from. So, for instance, directors represented a state, 2 Democrats from the Southwest, Harvey C. Couch from Arkansas, and Jesse Jones from Texas. That is information we actually have, and we digitize this, and this is a clear example of what the board of the RFC actually looks like. So we have their party affiliation, we have the state they're from, and when they actually were on the specific board. As you can see, there's a lot of variation both in Democrats and Republicans. So across party lines, this seems to be rather 50-50, but there's also a lot of turnover in terms of the state that they were from. So it's not that they're from one specific state. You see, there's a lot of, there's a very nice mix, at least across the RFC. Nevertheless, we were interested in knowing whether you could predict who the next person on the RFC board was. That is actually something we try to do first to really see, is this just purely random or is there a systematical variation? Basically, can we predict with state information who the next person on the RFC is going to be? Why is it interesting? Because maybe if there is systematic variation, railroads could eventually exploit this. Because maybe a railroad is only going to ask for a bailout if you know that there's going to be a specific director from the RFC on that specific board. So that is what we try to do. We use log information on bank capital in default, banks per capita, building permits, state population, size of the railroads bailouts, the number of railroads that get bailed out in a specific state. And you see that there's not much to go on. So there's nothing really, whether you can predict where the next person from the RFC actually is going to come. So this is good because this is something we can eventually use in our regression specifications. Why is this interesting for us? Because we're actually going to use connections as an instrument later. Because we're going to define a connection as the number of RFC directors from a specific state versus how much versus whether or not a railroad passes through that specific state. So to give a clear idea, the Chicago and Eastern Illinois Railroad applied for a loan March 32. It passes through Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri. And at that time, Paul Bestor was from Missouri, Charles Dawes was from Illinois. They both sat on the board of the RFC. So our connection variable equals 2. Why is this interesting or why is this important to us? Because there is a large literature that actually focus a lot on these political connections in terms of government aids. So that is something we're trying to use later on. So again, what is the key idea? We're going to focus on the likelihood of default on their debt, the ability to increase employment. But the first question we want to address first is like, who got these bailouts? So that is the first research question we are after. Is there some systematical variation there? So in the first stage, we're going to run a regression with the dummy variable that equals 1 if you applied for a bailout. And in the second stage, we're going to see if you applied, what are the firm characteristics that are going to determine whether or not you received a bailout. So what do we see? Well, we actually see that in the first stage, who applied for a bailout, those with less cash, that were younger, and also had more freight importance relative to passengers, and also were larger in size. So those were the ones who applied. who are the ones that actually got that bailout? Well, those are the ones who were more politically connected. An increase in the number of connections increased the likelihood that you get the bailout. So applying, there was some variation in terms of economic needs, but who eventually got the bailout that was solely driven by connections. We tried other specifications to actually show the same thing, and the results are very robust. It really seems that these political connections were driving whether or not you received a specific bailout. Now, what did the market actually think about this? So we're going to run an event study on all bailouts, focusing both on the application, the approval, or the rejection for bonds and stocks. So for stocks, we're going to compare this to the CRISP market index. For bonds, we're going to compare this to the Moody's market index. And what do we see? If railroads apply for a bailout, they see the cumulative abnormal return of bonds increase by 4%, which is statistically significant. Equity, 1.2%, but not statistically significant. If you get an approval of a bailout, you see your bonds increase by 1.6%. If you see a refusal, it's statistically insignificant, but magnitude-wise, it's relatively large, minus 2.5%. So you see, at least for bondholders, this is seen as very good news, which does make sense because that is the one key thing that the RFC actually wanted to do. They wanted to ensure principal repayment and interest payments. So for bondholders, this seemed to be very good news. We can actually split this up into first and subsequent bailouts, and there you see that the findings are way stronger for the first bailout. So in the first column, bonds increased by 9.8% in terms of their value. If they get approved, 4%. For all subsequent bailouts, it's still statistically significant for bonds, but it's only 2.4%. And when they got approved, 1.1%. So you see, it's really the first bailout that's driving this entire thing. So the market at least perceived this to be very good news. Now we're going to ask the question which we're aiming at, like, did it help? Did the RFC loans, did PWA loans actually assist to avoid bailouts, defaults? And there we do not find any evidence to this at all. So an increase in the number of approvals didn't really help or decrease the likelihood of a default. On the contrary, although it's insignificant, you see that it does point towards a more positive side. If we just focus on an OLS regression, then you see that there's an increase in the likelihood of a default when there is more approvals. And here we're using an instrument variable approach where our connection variable is our instrument. So we use this as an instrument to actually see, did this help when they eventually got it? And it did not really seem to. So it did not prevent a bankruptcy. What do we find? Well, we find those with lower cash holdings, those who were less profitable, younger, and more short-term maturing debt, they were more likely to default. But those who actually got bailouts, well, that did not really help. If we then turn this into a Kaplan-Meier type of hazard model, then, well, the evidence also points to this did not really help. So on the left-hand side, we do not include any control variables. And there you see that if you get a bailout, the chances of default increases by 30%. On the right-hand side, we do use control variables. You still see that the likelihood of bankruptcy after 7 years increases by around 10%. So it did not prevent a default. On the contrary, evidence seems to suggest that those who get bailouts are more likely to default. So far, what do we find? Well, on the one hand, we find that bondholders are very happy because you see bond prices increase, but default rates also seem to suggest that there's a positive trend, which is not very not very good. Now, did these loans actually prevent bond downgrades? And there we're going to run again these OLS models, but also use our instrument of variable approach with connections as our instrument. Again, we're going to focus on if there's just any downgrade on the one hand, or if there are multiple downgrades in the next 3 years. And what do we find? Well, there we do find a significant effect. If you get more bailouts from the RFC or PWA, you see a significant decrease in the likelihood of a bond downgrade. So again, bondholders are very, very happy with this news. Again, this does make sense because for the RFC, one of the key things they wanted to aim at was protect the credit structure. And it seems that rating agencies took this really into account. Even if we add rating fixed effects, these things hold. There's a significant decrease in the likelihood of a bond downgrade. Now, did this help in the larger scheme of things? This is help with operating performance. So there we're going to do 2 things. On the one hand, a difference in difference analysis. On the other hand, instrumental variable regression. We're going to look at 4 things: profitability, leverage, employment, and the amount of money that actually went to employers themselves. So really, we're going to focus on compensation, which we call the wage bill. So what do we see? If we actually look at profitability, those that got a bailout didn't really see an increase in their profitability. It's statistically insignificant, but nevertheless, it points towards a more negative story. On the right-hand side, we see leverage that decreased significantly, which makes sense because the RFC wanted to really benefit the credit structure of the firm. So it makes sense that they saw some deleveraging. Employment didn't move whatsoever, so there's no significant effect there. So on the one hand, the RFC did succeed in their mission to lower or to make the credit structure of firms safer, but stimulate employment didn't help whatsoever. And lastly, compensation, so the wage bill of those firms that did increase. So it seems that who was the one benefiting? Not the firms, because they didn't see an effect on their profitability. They even saw a decrease in the likelihood of default. But who were the ones that did gain? Bondholders, because they saw an increase in the value of their bonds, and they saw a decrease in the likelihood of a default. And lastly, who also benefited massively were employees themselves, because the wage bill did increase significantly. We do a large number of other stuff to actually control for median effects, or we looked at the first versus subsequent bailouts, staggered difference in difference. All points towards the same thing. We do the same story for instrumental variables. It all points to the same direction, that it didn't really help the overall health of firms at all. So for the last couple of minutes, I want to focus not on a macro scale, on a micro scale, but more on the macro scale. Because maybe those bailouts were also targeted towards the wider economy. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to focus on the map I've shown earlier. So we know through which cities that railroad eventually went through. And we're going to use the building permits per capita information from Wiedemeyer and Cortes to actually see if a railroad that passes through your city gets a bailout, is there an effect on the amount of building permits that city actually saw that year and moving forward. And there we do not really find a significant effect. On the contrary, in the first and the third column, we actually see a decrease in the number of building permits. But once we control for firm fixed effects, city fixed effects, year fixed effects, there we do not find a significant effect. So this already seems to suggest that for the wider economy, that didn't really matter at all. So if the intention of the RFC was not only to help railroad, but also to stimulate local economic conditions, well, that did not really fly at all. The second thing we want to do is, again, use that map and link this either to other railroads, but also to manufacturing firms. Because what we're going to do is, on the one hand, we're going to see whether or not there's overlap from the bailout railroads with other railroads, but also we're going to see whether or not there's overlap in the number of factories and plants that manufacturing firms listed on the New York Stock Exchange actually have. So in that sense, we're going to focus on two levels. First, whether or not there's overlap. So again, overlap means that the firm, which is either a manufacturing firm or a railroad, has at least one city in common with the bailout railroad, or non-overlapping, which means you have 0 cities in common, which is basically our control group. And then one step further, we're going to see whether or not there's high or low overlap. High overlap for railroad means you're a competitor. Low overlap means you need the other railroads, you're more likely to be an extension. For manufacturing firms, this means high overlap, you really need that railroad. Low overlap is, sure, you maybe need that railroad, but it's not so important for you at all. To give you an idea what this looks like, so for manufacturing firms, we actually go to Moody's and see that, for instance, this specific firm, I can't read, I can't read it very well, but that specific firm had 3 plants that were operated in Toledo, Ohio. We go to the railroad map, we actually see that the Toledo, Priora, and Western Railroad actually goes through Toledo, Ohio. So then we can match these two to actually see whether or not there's spillovers towards the real economy as well. So what do we find? First, we're going to focus on railroads. So railroads, again, overlap, no overlap, high, low. So high overlap means we're competitors, low overlap means we're an extension. What we're interested in is the difference below. So this is, again, an event study. We're going to calculate the difference in cumulative abnormal returns between overlap, non-overlap, high and low. In terms of application, this doesn't matter very much. In terms of approval, this matters very much. So if there's high overlap, those firms with a high overlap see a decrease in their value. If you're a competitor, you also see a decrease in your market value relative to an extension. So railroads that are an extension of the bailout railroad see an increase in their value, which is very nice. For manufacturing, this is the exact opposite. If you are highly dependent on that specific railroad, you see an increase in your firm value for application and also for approval. So if you're a big user, this is seen as something very good. So this means that there are some spillovers towards the real economy when a railroad eventually gets bailed out. So in the sake of time, I'm going to conclude. So the RFC was a body that actually tried to help the real economy and financial markets, or the financial sector at least, real economy and financial economy. They favored railroads from RFC directors in their specific home state, not so much those in economic need. It had no clear effect on stock prices, but it did have a huge impact on bond prices, around 10%, that 9.8% I was referring to earlier. Did they actually succeed in their goals? Well, they did not lower the chance of default at all. On the contrary, it increased slightly, but it did secure the credit structure because they reduced significantly. But it seems that bondholders were more favored than the actual firm itself. It did not improve profitability. It did not increase employment. Bailouts appears to have worsened the economic conditions in the cities that they were active in, but there were some positive spillovers towards other firms or extensions of those firms. And with that, I believe my 40 minutes are up. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm very looking forward to getting feedback and suggestions.
Thank you very much, Gertjan. Great, you're on time. And whilst people are thinking about their question, I already see a few coming on. I wanted to start things off. So a lot of people die in hospitals, right? Does that mean that the hospital is responsible for their deaths, or is it just that that's where people go to die? So what I mean here is one of your key striking results is that these bailouts don't prevent these firms from failing, and you make a very causal claim there. But maybe in a counterfactual, there would be even more failures. And I was wondering whether you could tease that out and think about maybe some kind of regression with matching, where you match by characteristics firms that do fail with those that didn't, but maybe could have. And maybe then you can start thinking about that claim and what it really means. But until then, you've got the hospital, basically.
So thank you for that. So we believe, on the one hand, that the instrumental variable approach does account for that to some extent. Now we've tried your idea as well. So what we've done is we matched those who get a bailout with firms from the exact same region and from the exact same size. So in terms of firm characteristics, we match those, and there we actually find the same findings, that it decreased employment, it decreased profitability, it didn't really increase any major statistic that we hoped to see if those bailouts were successful. And maybe if I can add to that, it can be true that there is no real economic impact afterwards, because maybe the money was badly spent. But we also see that those who applied, those who actually got approved, those who get approved were not the ones in economic need. They were more the ones that were politically connected. So that already worries us a little bit, that money maybe did not go to those with fewer cash, fewer profitability, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, I think you raise a valid point, and thank you for that.
So I have a couple of questions here from Gertjan Saka. Would you like to ask the question live? Or
sorry, it's to me. Sorry.
No. I'm asking Gertjan whether he wants to ask his two questions. Whether we can, I can't find him on the list anymore. Sorry, fail here. He's gone. Okay, right. Okay, well, then we'll do Melis. Melis, would you like to ask your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Melis.
Yes, hello. Very nice paper. Thank you, Gertjan. I guess I had two questions. The first one was whether one priority, or maybe hidden priority, if I may say, of the RFC could have been to help stabilize the banking system. So I guess by leveraging and helping the credit structure, then it helps the creditors. And also that could also be the bondholders. So I was wondering, one, if you can see any of these concerns, maybe in some internal archive of the, if there are any discussion. And second question was, do you have information on what was the profile of bondholders compared to shareholders, as they get very different returns ex post?
So thank you for that. So if I may, I'm going to answer the second question first. So do we have information? Not so much. As far as I know, I do not really know whether that information exists, other than some more qualitative findings that these were across the board available for life insurance companies, banks, and normal households. So we do not have that information. We looked for it, but we couldn't find it immediately. On the first question, do I understand your question correctly, that you mean that they're going to bail out the railroads because you have also banks that are involved with this in this railroad? So indirectly, through the railroad, to help out banks. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes. Like think of Greece 2012, for example.
Yes. So that's a good thing to actually think about. The only issue I see yet, and maybe we should look for it even more, is the point you were raising. How can we link specific banks to specific railroads? Because for one thing, we try to predict, we didn't really try to predict, but we saw that at least from a building permits perspective, there was not really much going on within the states that the railroads were active. So we can try to do something similar for banks as well. But I think it's a good idea to actually look for the profile of bondholders. Now, if I can add one more thing, you were saying about the effect that is maybe purely driven by the fact that there were many more bonds outstanding than stocks. So railroads were more likely to have bond outstanding than equity. So maybe that could also explain that effect. However, when we match both equity and bond from the same firm, we also find the same effect. So it's not driven by a selection thing there as well.
Okay, and maybe just a little follow-up, if I may, Chris.
Sure.
Do you have
an
archive of the board of the RFC when they could discuss, okay, our priority is to protect creditors, so let's reduce leverage, and like, back office discussion, something like that?
Unfortunately,
minutes of the approval committee.
As far as I know, that doesn't really exist. So there's very comprehensive information about the eventual decisions they make, but those discussions you're referring to, I've not found them yet. Again, we could look for them because that could be very interesting. We tried to see, for instance, at one point, one RFC member died. So we tried to see whether or not we could use that exogenous shock to see whether or not there's an effect there. Could not really find that. But what you're suggesting may also be a very good idea. So thank you for that.
So the next question comes from Angela Reedish. Angela, do you want to... I can't find Angela on the list.
I see her.
I'm here.
She's there. Okay.
Hi there.
Hi, Angela.
Hi. Thanks. I really enjoyed it. I had two questions. The first one was, I'll say the really short factual question was, it just seemed that in that table of board members, there were, I couldn't figure out how many there were at any point in time, but if that was the whole set, there weren't enough, I think. So I didn't quite understand, because many of them on that list of 20 people had gone by 33. Anyway, I just wondered how many board members there were. The other question was that it had to do with, there's a lot of reliance on this identification strategy, right? But the railroad thing was only 10% of what the RFC was doing. So most of that political impetus is doing something different, like helping banks in the States. And then I wondered if that circled around. It's a bit like Maila's question, but it's coming from the other side. It would have been a more important question from my point of view if your results had been that there'd been a big effect. And I would have said, oh, it maybe came through the banking system getting support from those RFC board members. But given that there wasn't that much impact, maybe it's not such a worry. That's kind of my question.
So thank you. So on your first question with regards to the board itself. So it varied from 6 to around 10. So a lot of times there was a lot of turnover, as you correctly pointed out. But there were around 6 to 10 people at the time on the specific board. Now, I didn't really have time to dive into the econometrics itself, but we always use lagged information. So in that sense, the fact that there is a lot of turnover should not really matter to a very large extent. Now, the second thing, yes, as I was saying to Melis, I think that could be something that is going on. And that is actually something we do see a little bit with the loss regression, with the macro spillover, that maybe indirectly you want to help other companies as well, which are using your line. But nevertheless, if you exclude banks for 1 second, railroads were by far the most important sector from an employment perspective, but also from a money perspective from the RFC. So even though that 10% may not be very large in terms of overall magnitudes, it's a very important sector. That doesn't diminish your concern, which, as I was saying to Melis, we're really going to focus on to really see whether or not that matters. The only thing I can say, which I haven't touched upon with Melis, is at the time, the overall US map was divided into a lot of sectors, 12 sectors where those railroads were operating in. And we always use sector fixed effects, section fixed effects, sector fixed effects. So it could be that there's one railroad that gets bailed out, the other one that doesn't, within the same sector, which are exposed to the same banks and banking shock connections, the channel you're referring to. So that could diminish to some extent your concern, but it's definitely something we should look into. Thank you. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Just on the number of board members, I had sort of in my mind a bigger number. So what proportion, I'm not quite sure how to think about a railroad. It could be a huge thing, or it could be a very short, like an observation is a railroad and it could be 2,000 miles or it could be 50. And then I guess I was interested in what share of your railroads were treated, in some sense. If you've only got 6 board members, is it only a small fraction of railroads that are in the treatment group?
In total, there are 42 who eventually got a bailout. Out of the sample of, I have to think, something around 100, 120. Okay. So a lot actually got a bailout, but not, I don't think the majority, but I have to look the numbers off to be very specific. Now, one thing okay, but of those that got bailouts, how many had connections? Like, that is the thing we actually are showing. So okay, that is the majority of the ones that actually, if you get a bailout, if you apply and eventually receive a bailout, you're more likely to receive if you have more connections. That is a bit of the point we're trying to make. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so Melis has a follow-up suggestion in the chat
yes.
As to potential archives to look at. You can read there.
Sure, thank you. And
the next question, while we're waiting for others to ask, the question comes from me. I was interested in, you mentioned public works administration quite a lot. How about, but you treat them all as one, right?
Yes.
In your analysis. I was interested in any differences that you observe. And then also I was interested in any differences between how this system works under the Hoover and Roosevelt administrations, whether you can see differences. We normally associate the New Deal with Roosevelt, and these are sort of proto-New Deal style institutions operating already under Hoover. It's quite interesting. But you know, was there any difference? So two things to think on whilst other people think about their excellent questions to ask. Oh, I see Rui has.
Can I answer yours, or?
You can answer mine, or Rui, do you want to ask yours, and then you can answer them all together, because we just have a few more minutes left anyway.
Sure.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, answer.
So I can be very quick. So wait, your first question, the PWA was relatively small. So to actually try to look for differences would be very hard because it only adds a few observations, but nevertheless, it was important. We haven't looked for differences across presidents, but we do use firm fixed effect. So that should capture somewhat of what you're after, but not entirely. So I don't have a direct answer for that. We could look into it for sure. Thank you.
Okay, so I had many of the questions that have been asked, so I won't repeat them. So two questions. One, so this was clearly directed towards bailing out the creditors, not the shareholders. Fine, but did you investigate whether they bailed out preferentially some senior creditors, the run-of-the-mill creditor? Did you observe any difference between the classes of bonds? You know, because there was a lot of creativity in structuring these bond products for railways. So did you notice something? And actually, who chose, you know, which classes of bonds to prioritize? Or were they all treated equally, right? So
I think that's a very good question, which we are currently looking into, because the National Archives has way more information with regards to that. So the ICC and the Moody's has some information, but the National Archives has more information. So we're currently looking into that. Okay, I can't answer that on top of it. Thank you.
Yeah, all right. Okay, it's an empirical question, but you understand why it might be interesting. The other one, so your overlap regressions, I think you're biasing the results against yourselves, right? So you don't need to, say, think of a firm, a manufacturer. You don't need to have a co-location with a train line or with a railway company for the railway company to be important to you, right? So maybe the line doesn't pass into Lido, but Toledo happens to be connected through a short connecting line to what in the UK they call a major trunk line, right? So you could do this better by looking at eigenvalue centrality.
Yeah, that's a very good suggestion. I was doing that this week.
And if I may follow up on that, whether the line actually passes through your area is not actually that important. It's whether there's a stop.
Exactly.
And the proximity of the stop. So
I'm looking at all of those nodes right now, and I'm doing this network type of analysis, whether or not if that node falls, if there's a huge change in the closest way to get from one city to another. So I'm very happy, and Lyndon will not be very happy to hear this. Because he was a bit reluctant to do that, but I was looking into that. So thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're more or less out of time now. So we're going to continue the discussion informally, and anyone who wants to switch their camera on and discuss with Gertjan and research plans and what he's going to do with the paper next, we can have an informal discussion. But for the formal session is now come to an end. The next seminar will be on 7th of December. It'll be a paper by Michael Bordeaux, Oliver Bush and Ryland Thomas, modelling through or tunnelling through UK monetary and fiscal exceptionalism during the Great Inflation. So looking forward to joining you in a few weeks' time when Nathan Sussman will be chairing the session. So thank you very much, Gertjan, and goodbye for those who are leaving us, and those who want to stay, please do put your hand up if you want to speak, and I can allow you to talk.
Thank you all for having me, and thank you so much for your interesting questions.
So,
okay.
Melis, do you want to come back on that point you were making?
Sure. So maybe it's a clarification, but can you maybe remind me what was, let's say, the power infrastructure above this committee, like how they were appointed, and where the bailout committee had to be giving reports to some federal authority, something like that?
So they were appointed by the president and eventually confirmed by the Senate. So you had this dual system to actually get somebody on the board. It had to be balanced across party lines and a bit balanced across states. So that's how they were structured. Sorry?
And so are there archives in the Senate or in the Congress about their performance? How, do they have to report ex post on what they've been doing?
So they did. I'm not sure what time frequency. I'm not sure if that's annually, for instance. Well, I have the final report, which is very comprehensive, that actually gives all of the information, like which companies they get money to, which sectors, when, how, all of these very comprehensive details we do have. What you were saying in terms of the actual discussion, so those minutes, maybe I could look into the idea that you gave. So far, we haven't found anything yet, but it's good to have a new avenue to explore.
And
I don't know if that answers your...
Yes, and even private paper, like if these board members were in some small number, maybe they had like some key correspondence with Senate members about how to direct or prioritize such and such bailout.
Yes.
So this could be interesting as well.
No, for sure, and I agree. Thank you.
Yeah, can I come back to Angie's question about the composition of this board? So the table 1, panel A, is this the full composition?
Yes, I'm gonna.
That's odd, right? Because there seems to be no terms, right? So there's lots of people who serve for a few months.
Yes.
There's a guy from Nevada that was there for 13 years.
Yes. Where is it?
How did this work? You know, how did I understand? You explained how they got there, right? So proposed by the president, approved by the Senate, but how did they get out?
So I know, for instance, one of the most important ones was Eugene Mayer. So the second one, he eventually got a better job somewhere else. This was just a landing spot for him to get other jobs. So Lyndon knows this better because Lyndon looked all of this up, but also what happened afterwards. And most of them either stopped because of illness, somebody died, but also some of them just moved on to their next position, or some of them just stayed on. So this is the entire list within our sample periods. It goes on even more because after 39, this still continued, but we just stopped at everybody who was from 32 to 39 in the board.
Is there a way of making use of those different lengths of terms and appointments and jobs that they went on to or not, you know, in your analysis?
Most of our information is on an annual frequency. Some information.
The guy who's there for 13 years, maybe you should treat differently than the guy who's there for 3 months.
Incumbency.
That could be true. Sure. Yeah.
Right. So political scientists will tell you there has to be an advantage, you know, for incumbency in committees. So he may have turned into the kingmaker. I don't know.
It's a good idea. So we've thought about it. The only problem, as I was saying, is most of our data is annually. So it's very hard to match like what happened between, let's say, January or March with annual data. But it's an idea worth looking into for sure. As I was saying, we thought about it as well.
So what are you going to do with this paper next? Are you presenting it elsewhere, or you've got a lot more work to do?
So most of the work we are currently doing is from the National Archives to really get, as Rui correctly was pointing out, all of the information with regards to the bonds, where they were for, what was happening, maybe to get more bailouts because maybe the New York Times didn't report all of them, so better get sense in that regard. That may be presented a few more times and then send it to a journal.
Okay.
We're thinking finance journal right now, but economic history could also for sure be a very nice outlet, we believe.
Caroline has a...
Hi, yeah.
Hi.
I'm not on camera, I hope.
No.
I'm in my
unless you're very, very still and don't move.
Yeah, that's very impressive.
I can't, because we're on webinar mode, so I can't even see anything but you guys. Like, you can't see participants. So, do you have my grown-up picture showing?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, got it. All right, so good. That's much better that you see that. So yeah, that's very interesting. I just wanted to get in touch about some work that you probably don't know I'm doing that is before this period. Well, you do know, how do you pronounce your name? It's probably something Dutch with fake J's, right? That don't
Exactly.
that
Gertjan.
don't sound, yeah. How do you say it?
Gertjan.
Gertjan, yeah. Oh, see, I did know the J is a Y, but we're still not sure how to say it. Okay, Gertjan. Yeah, we correspond a little bit. So I have some data in the pre-period that, might be interesting. You know about my stock market data. I have the, all of the stock prices, but I've also collected the Moody's data for now, and I'm still working on cleaning it for back to World War I. For all of these firms. So it might be interesting to look a longer time frame of what was going on with the railroads, and potentially interesting because this paper that I have with Marco Dellenhel and Mark Weidemeyer about the pandemic, and what we're the latest parsing we've done of it, we find that the railroads were most negatively affected. So, and it was a longer period, if you look over the first 20 years of the 20th century, it's a gradual process of kind of not doing very well. So it might be interesting to have like a prequel, if you will. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like looking back over the longer, I'm not saying you should do this for this paper. I'm saying that it might be an interesting, if you get in touch with me, I can provide you with more details on the data I have.
Thank you.
It might be
for sure.
It might be an interesting, it's kind of been on the back of my mind. I've had this paper planned for a long time. I've had the paper title planned called Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, that you guys might be too young to know this movie.
I actually know it, so yeah.
Oh, you do know the movie? Yeah. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles? Yes. So I've always wanted to write that paper. The first, 30 years of the 20th century, which is planes, trains, and automobiles. Anyway, so just wanted to let you know that I have, interesting data that might produce an interesting prequel to your story.
Thank you for sure. No, I will get in touch with you. Thank you for that.
Including and in fact, the Moody's is the entire NYSE from we're trying to get it as far back as possible, like get sketchier the farther back in time, obviously, you go, but we're trying to get all the financial accounting for the entire NYSE, and it goes up currently up to 40. We're trying to meet whatchamacallit, what's the database called with crisp CompuStat.
The CompuStat, yeah.
Which that starts late. It's like 60s.
In the 60s, yes.
Yeah. So we're not there yet, but we've got up to 40.
Like, so we also
15
use
to 40.
Yeah, we also use that information which you're referring to get the plant and factory locations. So I have the PDFs as well. I didn't digitize them yet.
The PDFs of Moody's, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So don't, if there's data that I can help you with, let me know, because we already have it entered.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
So yeah. Anyway, just be in touch. It's Thanksgiving though, so I just emailed you, Rui. So I'm going to be offline for a couple days because it's America. We have to like make too much food and eat it with our family for the
well,
next
you
day.
should enjoy it for sure. Thank you.
Okay.
And I will send you an email once Thanksgiving is over and Black Friday, Digital Monday, and how's the call is over.
It's mainly having my daughter home from college, so I need to. It's that, yeah. So, yeah. All right, that's all I wanted to let you know.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Is the paper up there? I didn't see a paper.
It is, Caroline. It is, yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
I saw there was so much, and I'm just.
I will send it to you in the email as well. Then you have
Okay,
my
yeah,
address.
sorry. I'm not able to read every word that I'm seeing these days because there's so many.
Obviously, it makes sense.
TLDR. Okay, talk to you
Okay.
later.
Thank you.
What's that?
So, if there are no further questions or comments or queries, then I think we'll bring it to a final close. There's only a few people left in the list of participants. It's basically us here and a few more.
Okay.
So
Bye.
I think we'll bring it to a close now. Is that all right, Rui? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Unless Gertjan has any question for us.
Nothing so far. As I wrote everything down, and I know what to do tomorrow. Not tonight because Belgium is playing at the World Cup, so tonight I'm off.
That's true. Yeah. Good luck with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna need it.
Right. Okay. Well.
Okay.
Good luck to Belgium, and
thank you so much for everything, and hope to see you soon in real life.
Bye bye.
Yes. All right.